Welcome back to Today Assets Report, the channel that cuts through the noise and gives you the real story behind every headline that matters. I am genuinely glad you are here today because what we are about to break down is not your typical crypto update. This is something much bigger, much more important, and honestly something that affects every single person who has money sitting in a bank account right now. Right now, behind closed doors at the White House, the crypto industry is locked into what may be the single most consequential negotiation in its entire history. We are talking about a deal that could legally allow stablecoins to pay real yield to hundreds of millions of ordinary Americans. Think about what that actually means. Your digital dollars, coins like USDC, potentially earning you real interest, not the embarrassing fraction of a percent your bank currently offers while they lend your money out at 7 or 8 times that rate and keep the difference. This is the kind of structural shift that changes how money works in America, and it is being decided right now in rooms most people do not even know exist. But here is the part that is not getting nearly enough attention. The banks sitting at that negotiating table are not there to make a deal. According to sources directly involved in these talks, they are actively working to blow the whole thing up while smiling and pretending to cooperate. And if you think that sounds dramatic, just wait until you hear what Morgan Stanley did while everyone was distracted, because that single move tells you more about how this ends than anything else you will read today. Voice. Liam set the stage properly so you understand exactly what is at stake here. Patrick Wick, a key White House negotiator who many of you will recognize from Ripple's Swell conference, is the man currently trying to bridge the gap between traditional banking institutions and the crypto industry over stablecoin legislation. The central question on the table is whether digital dollars like USDC can legally pay interest to users. Now, I know that sounds like a dry, technical regulatory question, but strip away all the legal language, and what you are really asking is this. Should everyday Americans be allowed to earn meaningful yield on their money using crypto technology, or should that money stay locked in traditional bank accounts, earning next to nothing while banks lend it out at massive profit and keep the gains for themselves? That is the real question sitting at the center of this entire negotiation. And when you frame it that way, you start to understand immediately why the banks are fighting so hard, why the talks keep stalling, and why someone with insider access decided to leak damaging and misleading information to the press. The stakes here are not just billions of dollars on a spreadsheet somewhere. We are talking about the fundamental architecture of American finance. And the people who built that architecture over the last century are absolutely terrified of what comes next. Voice. Now here is where things got really revealing last week. Someone claiming to be directly involved in these White House negotiations went public with some deeply negative comments about the state of the talks. This person painted a picture of a process that was essentially doomed, using language that insiders later described as completely fabricated and totally disconnected from the reality inside those rooms. The crypto world reacted exactly the way you would expect. Concern spread quickly. Selling pressure built up across the markets. The story of a failed deal began circulating across social media and financial news platforms faster than anyone could correct it. But then something unexpected happened that accidentally exposed the entire operation for what it really was. The banking representatives themselves came out completely perplexed by what was being reported. People from the American Bankers Association, the Independent Community Bankers, and the Bank Policy Institute, the actual humans sitting in those negotiating rooms, went directly to the White House and stated clearly that those comments do not represent their views in any way. Read that carefully. The banks themselves said that is not what we said and that is not how we see these talks. So if the banks did not say it and the crypto side did not say it, then who leaked it and why did they do it at that specific moment? Twice. The answer becomes completely clear the moment you stop analyzing this as a news story and start recognizing it as a deliberate strategy. What you witnessed was not an accidental leak from a frustrated insider. It was a calculated psychological operation designed with a very specific goal in mind. If you can convince the crypto industry that the deal is already dead, that the banks have effectively walked away, that the whole framework has collapsed beyond repair, you manufacture panic. You create selling pressure in the markets. You build a psychological environment where crypto companies feel cornered and desperate, where they believe they have no leverage left, and where they start making enormous concessions just to rescue a deal that was never actually in any real danger in the first place. It is one of the oldest and most effective negotiating tactics ever devised, and it nearly worked perfectly. But the banks accidentally blew the cover when they publicly distanced themselves from those leaked comments. By saying we never described these negotiations as hopeless, they essentially confirmed on the record that someone in or around those talks was deliberately playing games with market-moving information. That is not a minor clarification. That is a massive revealing tell, and people who were paying close attention immediately understood what it meant. Voice. And while all of that public drama was consuming everyone's attention, while the back and forth over who said what was dominating the conversation, Morgan Stanley made a move that deserved far more headlines than it received. Morgan Stanley, one of the most cautious, compliance-driven, regulation-obsessed institutions in the history of Wall Street, filed for a national trust bank charter. They want to launch an entity called Morgan Stanley Digital Trust. In plain language, they are seeking legal permission to hold your Bitcoin, your Ethereum, your XRP, your stablecoins, all of it, under a fully regulated and federally recognized banking structure. This is not a small startup making an aggressive bet on an uncertain future. This is one of the most powerful and conservative financial institutions on the planet officially applying to become a crypto custody bank at the exact moment when every public narrative is screaming that crypto is losing its most important legislative battle. If that timing does not make you stop and think carefully, I genuinely do not know what will. Because Morgan Stanley does not file for banking charters based on hope or speculation. They have entire departments of lawyers, regulatory experts, and people with deep government relationships. When they commit to a move like this, it is because the analysis on their end points to one conclusion with very high confidence. Voice. Here is what Morgan Stanley's filing is actually communicating. If you know how to interpret institutional behavior, they have looked at the same White House negotiations everyone else is watching. They have seen the same messy public drama play out. They have read the same negative leaked comments hit the press, and after running all of it through every legal, regulatory, and strategic filter available to them, their conclusion is that stablecoin yield is not a maybe or a distant possibility. It is an inevitability. They are not filing a banking charter because they think crypto might win this negotiation eventually. They are filing because they have already concluded that crypto has effectively won, and they want the infrastructure in place to capture the enormous wave of business that follows. While everyday investors were reading those manufactured panic headlines and questioning their positions, Morgan Stanley was quietly signing paperwork to become the institutional backbone of the crypto financial system. That gap between what institutions know and what public narratives are saying is one of the most important dynamics in all of investing, and right now, it is playing out in full public view for anyone willing to look clearly at what the evidence is actually showing. Voice. Now let's get into what is really happening at the negotiating table itself, because this is where the banks are running their most sophisticated and patient play. According to insiders on the crypto side of these talks, the industry has already made significant and meaningful concessions on the stablecoin yield question. They have compromised on multiple fronts. They have given ground on terms that matter, and the message being sent to the banking side is unmistakably clear. We have met you more than halfway. The framework is largely built. Now it is time to finalize this and move forward. But here is the uncomfortable truth that most people miss about high-stakes negotiations. When you are the side that concedes first and concedes substantially, you do not generate goodwill from the other side. What you actually do is reveal your floor. You show them exactly how badly you want the deal and exactly how far you are willing to go to get it. And once they have that information, rational negotiators on the other side have every incentive to keep pushing, keep asking, and keep stalling because time has shifted to their advantage and urgency has shifted entirely to yours. That is the trap the crypto side walked into, and the banks have been exploiting it methodically ever since. Voice. You can see this dynamic reflected perfectly in how each side is describing the current state of the talks. The crypto side is using language like the door is wide open and we are ready to close this. The banking side is still describing the process as giving input on text, not finalizing, not closing, giving input on text. That is a very deliberate and very telling choice of words. It frames the entire process as an ongoing drafting exercise rather than an endgame negotiation approaching resolution. There was reportedly a hard deadline today that was supposed to force a decision. But based on how casually and leisurely the banking side is describing their participation, that deadline might as well not exist for them. They are not sweating. They are not rushing. They are continuing to leisurely give their input while the clock runs out, which means they have either decided the deadline is not real or they have calculated that letting it expire actually serves their interests better than accepting the current terms on the table. Voice. Brad Garlinghouse stepped into this conversation publicly and said something that sounds like simple optimism, but is actually a carefully constructed strategic statement. He said the door to a deal is wide open and the banks just need to act in good faith and walk through it. Most people read that as encouragement, but pay very close attention to the specific language. Act in good faith. You do not say act in good faith in a negotiation unless you have genuine and specific reason to believe the other side is not currently acting in good faith. That phrase is not a motivational nudge. It is a diplomatic accusation. Brad is saying on the record, for every regulator and politician paying attention, we know exactly what you are doing and we are documenting it. And walk through it implies the architecture is already complete. The work is done. The terms are set. The only remaining step is a decision, and the delay belongs entirely to one side of the table. When a CEO of Brad's stature makes that statement publicly, he is not talking to the banks. He is talking to Washington, and he is building the evidentiary foundation to establish clearly who negotiated transparently and who ran a stalling operation dressed up as good faith engagement. Voice. Jeremy Allaire added to this coordinated effort with perfectly timed data that made the strongest possible argument without requiring a single word of advocacy. He dropped Circle's Q4 numbers publicly. $770 million in revenue, $75.3 billion in USDC in circulation, up 72% year over year. Those numbers were not released casually. The timing was surgical. At the exact moment when narrative warfare around stablecoin legislation is at its peak, Jeremy puts out data that demonstrates beyond any argument that stablecoins are not a future technology waiting for regulatory permission to become real. They are already real, already scaling, already generating massive revenue, and already holding $75 billion of value for users who chose them over traditional alternatives. That is not a pilot program seeking approval. That is infrastructure that exists and functions and grows regardless of what happens in any negotiating room. Jeremy is telling every regulator and politician watching that this market is already here. And the only question left is whether the framework will protect American consumers and keep this activity onshore, or whether obstruction will push it somewhere beyond American regulatory reach entirely. Voice. At the deepest level, what we are watching play out across these negotiations, these leaks, these public statements, and these institutional filings is something that deserves to be named clearly. This is the last stand of the old financial system. It is not dramatic or loud. It is not happening on a battlefield. It is happening in conference rooms with lawyers and regulatory language and carefully chosen words in press statements. But underneath all of that formality, the people who have controlled the architecture of American money for generations are fighting to preserve a business model that technology has made optional rather than essential. Your bank pays you 0.5% on your savings while lending your money at 8 times that rate and keeping the spread. That model works only as long as you have no better alternative. Stablecoins paying 5% are the better alternative, and the numbers Jeremy just showed you prove that tens of millions of people have already figured that out. The banks cannot lobby this technology out of existence. They cannot negotiate USDC into irrelevance. The best they can do is slow the regulatory framework, extend the timeline, and preserve their deposit base for as long as possible. And even that ceiling has already been exposed because when Morgan Stanley stops fighting crypto and starts filing to become crypto's bank instead, the message to every other institution watching is unmistakable. The tide has turned permanently, and your choice now is whether to adapt or get left behind holding a business model that the market has already moved past. That is the real story behind this negotiation. And today, Assets Report will be right here covering every development as it unfolds.